Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NIGP webinar from the experts Audit-Proofing Local Government Procurement. Today's webinar is being brought to you courtesy of Bonfire. Presenting today is Mark Funkhouser, Mary Hall Caballero, Amanda Noble, and Madison Rorskach. For those of you who have attended NIGP webinars in the past, you know that from time to time we ask someone from outside NIGP to provide their expertise and unique insight into an important issue we want to highlight to our audience. Across the years, those experts have represented both the public and private sectors, academia, and the nonprofit communities. All webinar content is presented strictly for educational purposes only and is not intended to be an endorsement of our speaker's organization, products, or services. If at any time during the webinar you need tech support, please send me a direct chat. Remember to engage with your peers by making sure you have your chat options selected to everyone. Please submit any questions you have to the Q&A box or the chat, and we'll take those as we can. Mark, would you like to go ahead and get us started?
Yes, thank you very much, Justin. Pleasure to be with you all today. The work that you do in purchasing is some of the most important stuff that government does. We hire people and pay them, and we buy stuff, services and goods, and that's how we deliver services to the public. When I was asked to do this, I was particularly pleased because I'm passionate about local government, and I'm passionate about local government auditing. And I think auditing is often a kind of a mysterious project to those of us who are outside of the government audit sphere. So what we're going to do today is kind of lift the curtain and let you see a little bit behind what goes on when auditors decide what to audit and how to audit and what to do with the findings. And to help us do that, we've got three very good, very prominent local government auditors. We've got Mary Hall Caballero, who is the Portland City Auditor. That is an elected position, so Mary is an elected auditor. Amanda Noble, who is the city auditor for Atlanta, that is got a very unique kind of setup where she is appointed through an audit committee that is comprised of some city folks and some experts from outside the city government, and Madison Rorskach, who is the city auditor for Denton, Texas, and is appointed by the mayor and council. What we're going to do, I'd love for you all to jump onto the chat and put your comments and questions to each other. We're going to have a conversation about auditing and procurement. We've got a screen up there now that tells you some of the stuff that we're going to cover, but feel free in the chat to make whatever comments or ask whatever questions you want. Obviously, we'll have some time at the end to deal with questions, but we won't necessarily wait to the end. If we see something that merits attention early on, we're going to talk about it. And we also have three polls that we're going to do. We're going to ask the group some questions after sort of each of the questions that I asked the auditors. And so to start, I'm going to ask this question, and I'm going to start with Madison. Madison, we looked at a particular audit that you did, the audit of accounts payable. I want you to talk a little bit about how it is that you came to choose that audit and what your principal findings were.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Mark. The audit of accounts payable we did, well, when we did it, we're still we're a pretty relatively new audit shop. We started in 2018 and we did this one in October of 2019. So honestly, we did it because accounts payable is an important thing to look at. There's a lot of money that flows through there. Like Mark said, the government pays people to do stuff and it purchases goods to make things happen. So that's really the why that we did it. And we actually found that in general, they had pretty good controls over how they were verifying that payments needed to be made, especially if there was like a purchase order. They had a pretty good match, three-way match system. and they were using a financial system. But we did find that they needed to look more at how that financial system, how the access was set up for that. So trying to make sure that people who could create purchase orders couldn't also enter requisitions and then, create their purchase orders based on that. We also found that the city didn't really have an easy way to make sure that it wasn't paying for something twice, especially if they'd already paid for something on a P card or an expense reimbursement or something like that. There just wasn't the data easily available to double check that kind of stuff. And we also found that there was a specific vendor that basically anybody who wanted to in the city could just purchase things from. It was Staples, so it was office supplies. Not that it's not really Staples' fault. It was the way the city had it set up. But anybody could just go to their website using a city account, purchase something and get it shipped to them. And there was no approval requirements for that. And so that was a huge control issue, obviously, because there was, who knows what we knew what they were buying, but who knows if it was approved. And the kind of the flip side of that for AP especially was that they were sending us invoices every time something was delivered, even if it was from the same order. So 6% of the invoices we were processing were from Staples, even though 0.1% of the money was going to them that we dispersed in total. So it's kind of a quick summary of what we found. And the Staples thing was crazy. I was just like, what are we doing here? So.
And so, Madison, what changes, if any, were made in the way accounts payable and purchasing was handled as a result of the audit?
There was some. They did review the financial system to make sure that was set up more appropriately, to make sure like the AP people couldn't put purchase orders in, and the people who could create purchase orders couldn't enter requisitions and things like that. They fixed the Staples issue. We're getting invoices at a more reasonable pace now, and people are required to have approvals there. What else did I talk about? I mean, we had an issue where we weren't requiring people to approve check requisitions under $5,000. So you could just have a check requisition and no supervisor had to approve it, which I was also like, why are we doing that? That was kind of an accident. It seemed like when we talked, they were like, "Oh, we're allowing that." It was like there was an old form that people were able to use, yeah. And then there was some improvements to receiving documentation as well that were made. That they were just making sure that those were entered appropriate. Like there was extra documentation for some items that was required now as well. So.
All right, thank you. And one of my colleagues has put the link to that audit in the chat. We'll do that with each of the specific audits that we talk about. So Mary, one of the things that governments are trying to do more and more is be fair and equitable in the way that contracts are distributed, and making sure that disadvantaged businesses and women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses get a fair share of the work and the money that's being spent by the city. And that was the topic of the audit that we looked at in your shop. Tell us how that audit was selected and what the principal findings were.
When I came into office in 2015, one of the things that I had prioritized is that we would always be including equity analyses along with our efficiency and effectiveness analyses. And this audit came to my attention because we were looking at a different audit, the Portland building reconstruction audit. And that is our big office building where most of our departments, our staff are located. And they had one of the city's initiatives, they have 5 initiatives to get at historically disadvantaged businesses. And one of them was to set aside 1% of the cost of any construction project and have that be available by way of grants to help diversify the workforce. And so that project was a $200 million, essentially, reconstruction project, and they received 39 grants for the 1% money that had been set aside for workforce development and or workforce diversity. And the city did not give out one of those grants. And so I was mystified about how you could have such good intentions. You have a deep history of inequity that you must address. You have seemingly done the right things, and you get not $1 out the door for that project. And so I also have an advisory council of community members that I like to hash over ideas and listen to what they're hearing in the community about how the city's doing. And I had an electrician who sat on my advisory council, and he was constantly in a state of agitation about how terrible the city was at these things. And so with these kind of messages coming to me, I decided that we had to go in and look at these programs, these 5 initiatives that the city had set up to help overcome our history of penalizing minority and women-owned businesses. And so we started looking at them, and that's why we launched it. And the findings that we had were pretty dire. We have some across-the-board failures of the 2 primary initiatives that we looked at were the one that was intended to grow prime contractors, and the other one was to diversify workforces through these grant programs. And what we found was that the city had achieved some of its goals on diversity, but hadn't reported that out. And so there was a lot of dissatisfaction with these programs. We were hearing lots and lots and lots. Every stakeholder, people on city council hated them. Developers hated them. Recipients hated them. Like, everybody was just in a state of agitation about the equity programs in the construction field. And what we found was they were hitting some of their aspirational targets, and they weren't telling that story. And so we were able to put that in our audit, that despite all of the dissatisfaction, there are some good things happening because of the initiatives. We also articulated in the grant program to diversify the workforce that the city had 2 false starts with that program, and that really hurts your reputation. It just makes you look like you don't care. It makes you look like you can't handle a grant program, and we have grant programs all over our city. And so that was a very difficult process as they tried to get that off the ground. And then it culminated with this Portland building reconstruction project where they didn't get $1 out the door. And it was just kind of hard to overlook that kind of evidence. We also found out that in the prime contractor development program or initiative, that white-owned firms got the bulk of the money. And so we're always wanting to understand, why does that continually happen, and what can we be doing in the future to keep that from happening? That program also has some money set aside for training and technical assistance, and that program was very poorly executed. And it was assigned to the procurement office, and that was probably not the best place for it to be. I think we're asking procurement professionals to do way too much and to have too much expertise. And I'm sure that every person in this webinar could say that they are understaffed. And so it's a running problem. And in this program, we had consultants who were in the program who were also getting contracts to be consultants to the program. And so it was fraught with trouble. And then our final finding was that procurement didn't do enough to protect the integrity of these programs. And so we were seeing evidence of certification fraud. Women-owned and minority-owned businesses were kind of fronts for companies that were owned by white males, essentially. And they seemed to be aware of them, but weren't taking any action to stop that from happening. And there was also bundling going on where there are certain thresholds for any project, $1 million or less is supposed to be offered to people who are participants in the program, firms that are participants in the program, so that they can have first crack at that work. And what we found was that people in our own organization were bundling their projects in ways that would supersede the threshold, so they didn't have to participate in the program. And so we thought that the procurement office did not do as good a job as they could have done to keep our own folks from engaging in that kind of conduct. And then again, there was inconsistent communication. Some city employees were out telling minority and women-owned firms, hey, we've got these projects coming up. Other city employees thought, oh, we're not supposed to say that because it's a project and we're not supposed to be doing that. And so the unintended consequence of that inconsistent communication was that the city was viewed as favoring some firms over others, some advocacy groups over others. And so there was a lot of real resentment among the potential contractors about the way the city was conducting its business. So those were the primary wide-ranging and kind of sad findings that we had in our audit. And I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about recommendations later.
Yeah. For Amanda, another area that is auditors are often called in is when there is a major contract. I think during my time in Kansas City, every time there was a big contract or a big procurement, there was controversy, and often the auditor's office was called in to sort things out. Talk a little bit, so that was the case with you and Hartsfield Airport. To talk a little bit about that audit, how it came about, and what your principal findings were.
Okay. And actually, that audit didn't come about because of controversy. The controversy started after we started the audit. But we decided to do the audit of construction-related contracts at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport just because of inherent risk. The airport's huge. They launched a $6 billion expansion program. And so we thought, oh, well, that's something we should be looking at. We started in November 2016. So in spring, a few months before that, the mayor fired the airport general manager, and the two of them traded insults in the press that kind of hinted at some kind of political interference. And then both of their attorneys retracted the statements and tried to make nice, but we just had that in mind that maybe something was going on. Then shortly after we started the audit in November 2016, in January 2017, big story in the AJC, a construction contractor pleaded guilty to bribing a former city official. And it was a construction contractor who had been doing work for Public Works, but at the time, nobody knew what this was all about. And then in February, so a few months after we started the audit, the FBI raided the chief procurement officer's office. He was fired. FBI seized his, city equipment, and we're all like, okay. So that's when the audit had already started. So we expanded scope. Instead of taking a sample of the procurements, we reviewed all like 63 procurements entered into between 2014 and 2016, or in any stage of the process, not just entered into. And so we released the audit in February 2018, and it's really bad to have an audit that has a birthday, but we delayed the release because of mayor and council elections. We actually finished before that, and it took a while to get the final report through the law department. We had legal issues, but we did release the audit. And our primary findings, as I said, we reviewed all of the construction related solicitations. The ones we reviewed amounted to just over $1 billion, and we found red flags indicating potential bid manipulation. So we found calculation errors in 13% of the proposals, including one that appeared to change the outcome of the award. We found 8 instances of a bid or proposal deemed responsive, apparently in error. In 3 of those cases, it changed the outcome of the award. In 11 cases, the Department of Procurement's responsiveness review is ambiguous, so we couldn't tell if they thought it was responsive or not, and not all the documents were there. And then the evidence of responsiveness review was missing in 29 cases. So over a third, we couldn't even tell what the results of the responsiveness review was. 10 solicitations were canceled over a review period. With 6 of them, the justification wasn't clear. And then 39% of the solicitations received fewer than 3 responses. So robust competition is a good control. So evidence of lack of competition could show that something is going on. Either bidders don't think the fix is in, so they're just not bothering, or some have inside information. And then finally, we found that the distribution of bid amounts could have indicated a heightened risk of collusion among bidders.
The one that stuns me is the math errors that you would find. I mean, with Excel and so forth, it's surprising that you would find that. Yeah. So I want to shift gears. So we've talked about specific audits. I want to talk a little bit about how you do audit selection sort of at all, and how purchasing or procurement would come up. And I should say, for those the folks in the audience who are both basically procurement professionals, auditors, the financial audit or the external audit of the city that is done usually by a commercial audit firm is essentially one audit of the financial statements. The government auditors are not going to do that particular audit necessarily, but they're going to do a limited number of audits during the course of the year. And so the issue of which audits to do and which ones not to becomes pretty significant. So again, Madison, we'll start with you. What is the sort of normal process that you go through to determine which audits you're going to do in a particular year?
Yeah, I mean, so we do what we call risk-based assessment to create a risk-based audit plan. And essentially what that means is we look at the entire city, look at different qualitative and quantitative factors, talk to department heads, city managers, things like that, to see what they're seeing going on. Just look at the amount of money that's in a budget and revenues and expenditures, and kind of take all that information and rank what we think are the riskiest areas in the city. And also, thinking about, well, we've already done audits here. We know that they're doing these, correcting these issues. Hopefully they're correcting these issues that we've seen in the past. So that's kind of the standard process we go through. And then in my office, the city council approves an ordinance that says, yeah, this is your work for the year. And did I answer your question, Mark?
Yeah, so you do a risk analysis, and talk a little bit about how you decide what is a high risk, medium risk, low risk.
Oh yeah, so basically we do that based on, in our office we do it on what we think financial risk, how much money is there in this operation in revenues and expenditures, reputational risk, right? What's going on in the world around this issue, with like police and things like that, that has a higher reputational risk, right, than just streets. Although streets might too, depending on your city. We also look at safety, we have a water plant, so that's a huge safety issue if for some reason our water plant went down, but also with streets and car accidents and things like that. And so we kind of evaluate all those things on each factor and look at kind of what comes up the highest that we haven't already looked at recently, basically.
All right. So it goes beyond the money. Money matters, but you mentioned reputational risk, the police, the water system, so on.
For sure.
So Amanda, I want you to talk a little bit, and I would just note that you started right out with saying that in the airport's case, it was just that it was a huge amount of money. Before the controversy erupted, it just seemed like something you couldn't ignore. So talk a little bit about your audit selection process.
Okay. It is really similar to Madison's, in fact, and we're trying to revamp it a little bit. So Madison, please send me your risk assessment. I can see what we can borrow, but we have various measures that we look at, and it's based on the chart of accounts and the organizational structure. So we, and we look at number of staff, expenditures on supplies versus capital, and we have some performance risk, seeing if, are they meeting their performance measures? Do they have performance measures? Try to think of some others. They roll up into like 6 factors, and then our audit committee decides which factors to weight more heavily, and then you get a score, and then you get organizations ranked. And then we typically we would go talk to the commissioners of the departments and ask them what they thought the risky areas might be. But because our office is partially funded by our enterprise funds, so the airport and the water, we're always looking for something to audit there, and there's plenty to audit. So it went in terms of the airport, that was a big thing.
And I know that, in some cases, you do an audit, or you decide to do an audit because somebody asked you to. As I recall, the police chief asked you to take a look at the body cameras. Talk a second about that.
Yes, we do. We talk to the department heads, and sometimes they just request. I think I've got 5 requests right now, which is great. 3 from city council and 2 from management. So I'm pleased that they, find our work valuable, but it's like trying to find, they want it done yesterday. And I'm thinking, well, we might be able to start in, August.
Yeah. All right. And Mary, what is the process that you go through to decide what to audit?
In charter, as the elected auditor, I am the sole responsible party for picking the audits that we engage in. And we have a process where we're taking audit ideas year round. We then usually in April, May, I'll get together with my team and we'll go through the list of audits. We do some preliminary research about what the scope might be, what the issues are, and we're looking at like Madison and Amanda have mentioned, the similar things like high dollar amounts, risk of failure, risk of something not going appropriately. And then we also factor in equity risks, and we also factor in community perceptions. And so we're doing a lot more community outreach, engagement with community groups. And what we do in those instances is that we're listening for what they are saying about the city, because that's where we're either cutting it or we're not cutting it with the community. And that is something that was really unusual when I came in. And so I found it to be super helpful in the way we select our audits. And having said all that, procurement is just an inherent risky area. And Amanda used that terminology earlier, and I would just want to call that out again. And when I came into office, a procurement office was underway. I have done 5 additional audits that touch on procurement or have been of the procurement office in the city of Portland. And that's my way of saying that you can't escape us, so you should embrace us. Because we are going to be in your business at some point or another about something or another. And there's just no way around it, because procurement is just so key to the way the city functions. And Mark, you said that too. That's how we pay for things, and that's how we get things done. And it's also inherently risky because it's hundreds of millions of dollars in the city of Portland that we are transacting every year. And anytime you have sums of money like that, you have trouble. You have people who want to get their hands on that money. It is inherently political. The council members and the project managers, they want to get those projects on the ground, get them running. And then there are the poor procurement professionals saying, wait just a minute, we have some rules here that we need you all to abide by. And so there's a lot of push and pull, and we have leadership turnover, we have staffing shortages. And so all of those things would lead me to keep my eye on procurement questions as we are going through our process of selecting the topics. And then we can select topics and end up in procurement at some point, like we did with our Portland building audit, where we didn't intend that to be a procurement audit, but we were making recommendations to the chief procurement officer out of that audit too. So we're always circling back into the procurement world.
Yeah, when you said that, I saw Amanda and Madison both nodding in agreement. You know, you started one place and you wound up, you know, at least in part in procurement. Amanda, one of the questions that that came through, I missed it at the time, but it's relevant. You said you found bid manipulation, and the question is, can you talk a little bit about that? What that looked like? How you suspected that it was bid manipulation?
Yeah, and just to clarify, we found red flags of bid manipulation. To actually prove it, there would be, you know, a trial, which there was, but not on this audit. And I think you were going to talk about red flags a little later for one of your questions. Do you want to hold that for then, or you want me to talk about it now?
Launch right in.
Launch right in. All right. So the red flags. So specific to bid manipulation, let's see, I wrote some of them down. And they're really process related. And I'm sure the audience here is aware of all the different steps and rules that we follow to ensure a fair process. So really any kind of flag that the process wasn't followed is going to be a red flag, because it could be giving somebody an unfair advantage, and it could be giving somebody an unfair advantage because, you know, a government actor will benefit from it through a, you know, undisclosed conflict of interest or a kickback. So if clarification sought by proponents is not answered in writing and circulated to everybody, that's a red flag. Any kind of indication that some bidders are receiving more information than other bidders, and Mary talked about that in the context of the disadvantaged businesses, but that could be a red flag for bid manipulation, because somebody is benefiting from that. Any kind of delay between the deadline for submitting and opening the submittals could be an opportunity to feed information to a preferred vendor. When a winning submittal is voided for errors or technicalities, if submittals are lost and aren't recorded, if a qualified proponent is disqualified for, you know, what appear to be questionable reasons, or conversely, someone who's a vendor who's not qualified is found to be responsive, those could be indications that a favored, you know, vendor is getting favored treatment. Not enough time, inadequate publicity or advertising, not enough time to respond to bids could be a red flag. And then the literature also said a significant number of qualified proponents failed to bid. So that's why we were concerned about the 39% of our solicitations having fewer than 3 responses. And if there are political figures on evaluation committees, that's a red flag. Any indication that evaluation criteria changed during the evaluation is a red flag. Voiding or canceling bids is a red flag if there's not a good reason for it. And then just in general, poor controls over the process, because poor controls could cover for any of this.
The comment you made about elected officials in the process, I did a podcast for Bonfire, and I was asked, you know, what was my role in purchasing when I was the mayor. And the answer, of course, is none. As a candidate for mayor and as the mayor, I spent a lot of time asking people for money. You don't want somebody who's in the business of asking people for money to decide who gets a contract or to have any role in who gets a contract. Madison and Mary, Amanda went through a whole list of red flags. Any that you would add or that you would highlight that she mentioned? And I'll start with you, Madison.
I don't know. She had a lot of good ones. No, I mean, I think they were all good. And, you know, I think the big thing is, right, is when do people not follow the process or the policies, right? That's a red flag, because you're like, well, why didn't you?
Right.
So I would just highlight that general theme, I guess. That's what you look for, especially as auditors, right? We were like, what's their process? Did you follow it? That's kind of the standard testing. So
Yeah. Do you have rules? Did you follow them?
do you even have rules is also a good question.
It's to me, it's often surprising that they won't know whether, I'll say, well, that sounds good. Did you do that? Well, yes, I think so. Well, okay. How about you, Mary? Are there red flags that you would add that you've seen in your work in Portland?
I would add one thing, and it's not necessarily a red flag. It may be one of those inherent risk things, but anytime there's large information technology purchases by government, we will have to be there, just because we have so many of them that go off the rails, and we generally try to start at the procurement stage. And that's not even necessarily a procurement problem, but it is a real problem, especially for, I think, local governments when they invest in multi-million-dollar IT things.
Mm-hmm.
I can, Mark, toss in a couple of other red flags. I was focusing on the bid manipulation because that was the specific question, but you can, so red flags for potential collusion among bidders. You can look for unusual bid patterns. So if there's rotation of winning bidders by geographic area or time or other factors, bid spreads of less than 1% or more than 20% could indicate sharing of information, or inadequate specifications, which could also be, for a corrupt reason. And if you have line item bid prices by different bidders that are identical or like exact percentages apart. And sometimes you can see things where, apparent connections between bidders, like common personnel or addresses or phone numbers, or losing proponents hired as subcontractors. So any kind of relationships like that could also hint at problems, but more on the vendor side than the government employee side.
I have a certain nostalgia about bid rigging. When I started my career in audit, it was just as the big bid rigging scandal in Tennessee broke that eventually put Governor Ray Blanton in prison. It was, and so it was, as I was a brand new auditor joining the audit office, the office was all the Twitter and involved and embroiled in auditing bid rigging for road contracts, and a bunch of people, including the governor, went down over that. And I thought, well, this audit stuff, this is fun. This is pretty cool.
So Patricia asked a question: are tied bids an indication of foul play by bidders? And the answer is it could be, but any one-off instance, you're not sure. So you have to look for patterns over time. So sort of collecting the data, having data available to analyze over time is your best bet at catching it, because any one instance that looks suspicious, it's hard to tell.
Yeah, in Tennessee, the thing that showed up was rotating the bids among contractors, about 3 or 4 big road contractors, and they literally took turns. And but you had to see a pattern. You had, and then eventually somebody essentially talks, and that, then you find out. One of the things that has come up in 2 or 3 places in the chat is the audience would love to see the risk assessment template that the auditors use. And I think that's real smart, which leads me to my next. Oh, and polling. We were supposed to do polling after the questions. Let's do the first poll now. Justin? All right, the first poll. Have the impacts of the pandemic prompted any major changes to your procurement operation? And check yes or no, or only minor changes. I'm interested in the result here. We'll give folks a minute or two to respond. And then I would love to know sort of what the auditors think about this. My guess, I'm going to guess that the answer is yes, but we'll see. Give folks another 30 seconds to check one of those. All right, Justin, can you show us the results? So yes, it is either significant changes, half the people, or minor changes, only 12%, no changes. That's where I would have imagined. Let's ask the auditors, what's your reaction to that? Mary, what do you think?
We did an audit of the use of purchase cards during the pandemic because so many of us went to a remote work situation, and the internal controls that we knew existed in the city for when everybody's all together in their offices, we thought now they've got the purchase cards at home, and how are they getting the supplies to the different employees? And so we did a look at that, and our findings were good ones. We found that they were largely doing what they were supposed to be doing with the purchase cards. And we did go back to some underlying problems that had nothing to do with the pandemic, but that our procurement office needed to shore up. And so we made recommendations around that. But we were pleased to see that the findings, there was not, people were not going crazy with their procurement cards during the pandemic.
All right, Madison, what's your reaction to that result?
Yeah, I'm not surprised by it. We did an audit of like disaster expenses kind of right after the pandemic started in like July or something of 2020. And we saw a lot of emergency purchases, and we were like, okay, that's fine for now for hand sanitizer, but what are we doing in the future? And so just trying to make sure that we complied with the laws while also understanding that there were huge supply chain issues, and I mean there still kind of are for yeah, I don't know.
Right. Amanda, any reaction from you?
Yeah, I'm not sure if we've had changes in procurement. We don't have P cards, but we've looked at accounts payable like Madison has, and we have a lot of direct pays, which are sort of the way around purchase orders, and that may have increased during the pandemic, but it's always been kind of high. So there's some weaknesses that could be exploited. We definitely have had issues with inventory during the pandemic, and less segregation of duties than there should be. But I think a lot of the procurement segregation of duties are sort of automated and wouldn't be affected by the mandatory telework.
Mm-hmm. All right.
So I'd be interested in hearing what the major changes were.
Well, you've anticipated my next question to the audience, which is that I would love for some of you to put in the chat what the changes were. Was it changes in staffing or technology or vendor engagement? What are some of the changes? And while they're putting that in the chat, and the first one comes up from Nikki Thompson, she says technology. Justin, let's do the second poll.
Okay, and I am seeing, so we did start using DocuSign, and we were automating some of the process. So I guess we did have major changes, and I didn't even recognize it. So thank you.
All right, So what is the biggest obstacle your department is facing? Is it legacy technology systems? Is it staffing and capacity constraints? Is it difficulty expanding vendor diversity and competition, or is it something else? And again, I'll give you about a minute to fill that out. I have a strong winner in my mind, but I'm not going to say it because I don't want to influence the results. And while we're waiting, there is just a raft of good responses in the chat on the changes. The use of technology, applying more professional judgment, explosion in software purchasing, that's something I would think is right. Online bidding, technology, PPE purchases, many people are writing all of the above, and that sort of thing. All right. So Justin, let's see the poll results here. I'm going to guess it's staffing, and yeah, it's staffing is number one, legacy technology number two. I would have guessed the difficulty in expanding vendor diversity would have been a little higher, but in our work with my little company, we interview government officials every day. Staffing and capacity constraints come up in about every interview. Reactions to that one. Maybe we'll start with you, Amanda. What's your reaction to those poll results?
Oh, well, I would have said all of the above, but I agree on the staffing. And, especially after going through a big scandal in, Department of Justice investigation, there's a lot of turnover. It's very demoralizing.
Mm-hmm.
And even our audit that found the red flags. I mean, it's not the employee's fault that the control environment is poor.
Mm-hmm.
So keeping staff in that environment was really tough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mary, your thoughts?
I would agree with Amanda by saying all of the above would probably be what our procurement folks would say. And I think that the staffing issues are what they pointed to a lot in the audit that we did, that they are being asked every day to do ever more with the same level of staffing that they always had, and we're transacting more business every year with the same level of staff that they've always had. And so at some point there is a break there, and it becomes very hard to keep people in procurement when they seem to always be caught in the political crosshairs of things, and their workloads are exploding. And what I've asked the city to do is to reevaluate how what are the thresholds that somebody in the procurement office needs to touch something.
Mm-hmm.
Because we are still at anything $5,000 and above, they have to touch it. And I just think that seems a little ridiculous given how their work is exploding. And I think that the city needs to go back and do some risk calculation on that. Like where are the risk areas, and then point their resources toward those risks and mitigating those.
Mm-hmm. I love how engaged this audience is. I mean, they're really putting lots of good stuff in the chat. My last question for the three of you. So if one of these purchasing folks asked you to come to their city or county and talk to them about how to better survive the next audit, what's your advice for audit-proofing their operation? Madison, let's start with you.
I mean, I think, document everything. Some of the things that my procurement department did after we came through is they created more forms. That's not a great thing to have to go through, but we had a huge issue where people were trying to sole source purchases all the time, which it's like, you can't sole source everything because that's not what the law says. And so, they created a justification form, and they have a committee that reviews all purchases now. And one of the things that makes it easy to audit is in our financial system, they have all the attachments that you would need already in there, right? So I can just go to a PO and see that justification form without having to go to a different area, which, you know, I know we talked about legacy systems, right? So maybe that's not always easy to do. But yeah, I think just making sure that things are documented and approved. All purchases, not just purchase orders. P cards are a huge, you know, we did a P card audit and found that almost no P card purchases were approved at all. And it's like, okay, well, what's going on with that? So that goes back to documentation, because that's how purchasing works, right? That's what you're doing. You're a control function. So
Your control function, yes. Yeah, write that down. That's right. Amanda, audit-proofing the operation.
Yeah, I agree with Madison. Have written policies and procedures and documentation that you follow them. And then, you know, we have a question about split purchases. I was really fascinated. Mary mentioned bundling. So here, since the threshold is things above are required to do something, it's the split purchases to stay below the level. So, you know, looking for evidence and, you know, making sure that your departments that you're, you know, controlling, I guess the word is, aren't splitting purchases to avoid the rules or bundling or what have you.
When, yeah, so the split is the one that I've seen back in the day. That and Madison mentioned sole source. And there's a lot of stuff that, you know, when there's especially a political scandal, there've been a number of them in California recently. And when you follow it back, oh, it was a sole source purchase. So Mary, audit proofing.
I spent a lot of time on this question. I made a bullet list. I want to back up just a little bit from the specifics, and if people haven't been audited, just to talk a little bit about generally what we're doing. And so audit professionals are charged with doing certain things. And so we're going to come in and we're going to look at what you're supposed to be doing. And then we're going to look at what you're actually doing. And if there's any gaps between those two, we're going to make some recommendations on how to close the gap. And so if you aren't being actively audited right now, it's a good time to think through how am I going to tell my story and how am I going to provide the information to the auditors so they can verify my story. So that's essentially the big picture of what we're doing and what you should be doing in advance of us coming, because as I said earlier, we're coming. And a good place to start understanding us is to read audits. If you have them in your jurisdiction, read them and see what kinds of things we're finding other places, what kind of recommendations we're making, and then you can look at the audits in other jurisdictions too. So I think you have 3 links now in the chat for audits of the 3 of us did. Those are always great. You'll be a smarter auditee if you read some audits. The other thing you can do, I think in most cases, is you can meet with your auditor. If you're not actively being audited, it's probably a good idea to do it outside of the heat of an audit and ask them what it is that you're doing. What do you look at? And what kinds of audits do you do? Maybe they're doing financial audits. Maybe they're doing compliance audits. Maybe they're doing performance audits. Those are all good questions for you to ask. What the auditors won't answer you, though, is tell me what I should be doing, because that's your job, not our job. You should have the management fundamentals in place. Amanda and Madison both said that. You should have policies and procedures, roles and responsibilities. And if you have a regulatory function and an advocacy function where you're trying to diversify your firms and create more, if you could keep those folks separate, that's a good thing to do, because we almost always want to know about that. Use checklists to ensure that your procurement staff are following your procedures, and always document when you depart. Anytime you change what you're supposed to be doing, it happens to the best of us that things don't work out. Document why you made the decision you did and what factors you took into account. You can conduct a periodic self-assessment for compliance, and that's so you know where your own gaps are before we get there, because we will find them. And you should collect measurement data related to the policies that your councils or governing bodies have put in place for you to implement. You should also document workload goals so that you can tell that story if you're understaffed. Because we're going to come in, we're going to ask you for data. We always ask for data, and then we have to do a reliability check to make sure it's any good, because we can't reach conclusions with bad data, and you shouldn't either. You should anticipate who will try to get around your rules. And if you can put steps in place and demonstrate those to your auditor that you're trying to watch for those things and mitigate them, that always makes us very happy. You can watch for unintended consequences showing up in the results and act to mitigate those. So in the audit that we did, those social equity initiatives had been in place for 10 years. And some of them were listing badly. And because they weren't collecting good data, they didn't know that. And then we came in and it was a pretty harsh audit at that point. And then I will put on the last thing, it's the hardest and maybe impossible thing to do. If you can communicate your limitations and manage expectations of your policymakers, some of the things that the city council was asking our procurement office to do were very ambitious. They're very wide ranging. And it's such a regulated environment that you operate in. And in terms of the social equity programs, there were some legal hurdles that the city had to overcome and had not. And so it really was a no-win situation for our procurement staff. And I think that's the hardest thing to do. And maybe you all would think that was a dangerous thing to do, to speak up and say, you know, we can't do that. But if you can, you should do that always, I think, for your own peace of mind.
That's really valuable advice. Somebody has up here also, the state of Florida Auditor General has a great online reporting. Virtually all the significant audit offices have all their reports online. And just for fun, just Google sometimes scathing audit and just see what's being said out there. I'm going to close us out. We've got just a couple of minutes left. I'm going to close us out with the last polling question that is audit related. So Justin, put up the last one. So how concerned are you, would you be to learn about an impending audit of your operation? Not concerned, somewhat concerned, very concerned. And we'll give you all a minute to answer that. It would have been fun if we'd have done that twice. One at the beginning of this and one at the end after you heard from these folks, the kind of stuff that you probably need to do to make sure that that you're okay. All right. Not concerned, somewhat concerned, very concerned. And where I tried to guess and got it right the other two times, I'm not going to, I have no idea how this is going to come out. Justin, go ahead and show us the results. So, you know, a small majority, somewhat concerned, very tiny amount, very concerned. But 4 out of 10, nah, I'm not worried. It's going to be fine. All right. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I get to talk about auditing with some of my favorite auditors, and I talk about local government, which I like. Amanda, Mary, and Madison, thank you very, very much for what I think was a great webinar. We're getting lots of positive stuff here. Here's the contact information for these folks. Get in touch with them if you want to see things like their risk assessment template. And thank you. Thank you all very much for attending the webinar.
Thank you, Mark, and our panel and the audience for their participation. Please take time to fill out the evaluation survey. Once we end the webinar, you'll receive a prompt to take that. Both the recording and survey links will also be emailed to you later this afternoon. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
All right.
Thank you.